get started, I just wanted to let people know that I just got off a call with the people from the Michigan Health Information Network, and they are starting a significant new program in an environment that they call interoperability land. I'm going to be adding them to the calls, and the goal there is that they're going to provide us with an environment where we can put up services and test the services and so forth. They also have a lot of experience in this space. So probably next week, we'll just give a shout out to them. They will be on the call in the future. And the goal there is to provide an environment where services can be deployed and we can exchange information using the dominant standards that are out there, things like FHIR, things like NIC, activities that we've talked about in the past. But that's a significant new effort to start to engage with others in. So if we look at this diagram that we've got on here with HIE and EHRs and so forth, that is what we have talked about in the past, all these different domains that have information that we want to exchange with, and then an ability to have APIs or mechanisms to reach those different domains, and the security environment to ensure that the individual and the application that's accessing that service has been granted permission to be able to access that information. So this is just kind of a place setter as to what we have talked about in the past. The other project that we have focused on is cross-domain name sharing, so that we can identify across domains. Is this really Daniel Stein? Is it the same Daniel Stein that may be known as Dan Stein or Danny Stein or some other name in a different domain? And Pradeep and Rita are going to give us a little update on where that breakout group is right now. And I think a significant portion of the conversation today is going to be talking about how to address that cross-domain name sharing, which is complicated. It's not unique to human services. It's not unique to healthcare. So we need to broaden our horizons a little bit and look at what the industry, the IT industry, is doing to facilitate that cross-domain name sharing. So Gillian, can you go down one slide? Okay, that's just a little bit, that's fine. So one of the things that we have talked about doing is compiling a catalog of services. In other words, a list of all the services that may be there that it would be fruitful to exchange data with. And in that catalog of services, we have said that we would want to include the URI endpoint, how you reach this service, what the data model is. And so far, we've had a discussion that the data models in healthcare will probably tend to be FHIR oriented. And the data models in human services may have a mixture of both NIM and FHIR. But then we also have to address the protocols and the security mechanism to be able to exchange information there. Next slide, Gillian. Thank you. And one thing that I would like to talk about just before we get started with Pradeep and Rita, who are the users of these systems that we're talking about? So we've laid out a number of the domains, a number of the services that will be used, but one of the topics that we haven't talked about very much is who are the end users that are going to be interacting with these systems? I believe the potential is there for a citizen to be able to interact with the system, a caseworker, a parole officer, a whole raft of different users. And I'd like to open the conversation up to others who have a vision of the individuals that may be using these services as we move forward. Certainly to me, the citizen is one that we should not ignore. So let me start with you, Eric, if you don't mind, because if I recall, you are just getting started in defining your system as it moves forward. Have you all had discussions about who are the end users of these systems?
Yes, I definitely. I mean, we're further along than definition phase. We've got APIs implemented, but and they use a lot of the same standards you listed, OAuth 2 and OpenID and RESTful. But anyway, I'd say another user we're missing that's a key one is the data scientist, data analyst, the person at either the local or the federal level who's looking at this from like a warehouse kind of perspective as opposed to data in motion for live coordination, real-time coordination.
Gotcha. And
Marshall,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I paused for too long. I only say that just because I got out of a conference of those kind of people, and I think they would they would object to them being out of this list.
Yeah. Actually, Eric, this is Tom Sylvius. Something you might want to check out. Are you familiar with a group called PCORI, Patient-Centered Operation? I forget what the acronym stands for. It's PCORI.
Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute.
Yeah. They're working on a thing called the Clinical Data Research Network. There are about 11 projects around the country. And some of them are addressing specifically that use case. To a degree of where researchers and data scientists need access to large data sets where they can basically create queries on the fly and get large data sets virtually in real time. It's worth checking out.
Yes, thank you.
So Tom, when you say large data sets, what do you envision as large?
Well, genome data for one thing. The New York project for this includes the New York Genome Center as kind of at the center of these queries. And for data science, not only for clinical conditions, but also for observations from across multiple integrated delivery networks and things like that, but also to include things like genome data sets, which are rather large.
So that's going to bring up another question, I think, and I'll make sure that we address it as we move forward. But most of what we have talked about so far, whether it be the Nome data model that's being exchanged or FHIR data models, it tends to be request response and fairly small in terms of the data sets that are brought back. There are other approaches to it like publish, subscribe, and so forth that are typically used for much larger data sets. But I just noted that that may be something that we want to consider if there's going to be exchange of really large data sets.
For Washington State, we have some analytical data activities that will take, for instance, a month worth of opioid prescriptions and compare that against a person data set. So we might be matching 10 million prescriptions against 3 million people to find the correlations.
Gotcha.
That's what, that'd be a typical analytical activity.
Yep. I got it. So Eric, could you give us just a real brief overview of what you guys are doing up in Washington?
We're doing several things. At the Department of Health, we do a lot of population health analysis, social determinants of health, attacking the opioid epidemic through data analysis. And that's one thing. But the other thing, the reason I'm here is the Department of Social Services, Department of Youth, and other organizations want an MPI, and to build an MPI so we can get 360-degree view of a citizen, so we can achieve better outcomes of coordinated care.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So, Marcelie, question for you. When we start dipping into education, who do you see as the primary users of those domains? Is it the students? Is it the teachers? Is it the school district? Marcelie may be on mute or had to step away for a moment.
I think it's all of the above, Dave.
Yeah, so that is something that we haven't discussed very much. Gillian, if you could go down one more slide. And let me just see. Just one more, Gillian. So one of the things that I'd like to discuss is as we have these APIs starting to become available for these various domains, having a proof of concept client-side application to be able to access that data. We are looking right now about an open source implementation of something that's denoted down here as Unite. So it's not, quote, a product, if you will, but a framework of how you would be able to access these various resources. And some of the technologies, I know there's a number of us that are going to hate some of the technologies that are coming out in the marketplace, things like chat bots, if you will, that are able to access data. In the healthcare space, it may be, please find me a provider that's on bus route 7 and he needs to be a chiropractor. And then artificial intelligence, machine learning, and so forth gets better at how to query those back-end systems to be able to get that information and present it to the user again. So one of the goals is really to have a proof of concept that's going to progress as time goes on to really start to look at who is going to be accessing this data? What are they going to be using it for? Is it a client? Do they want to have some level of access from cell phones or browsers? How are we going to manage security? Are they allowed to be able to access this data and so forth? So over the course of the year, we want to be able to build little proof of concepts to get the conversation started in these arenas. So with that being said, Pradeep and Rita, can you give us an update on the person matching activities?
Sure, absolutely, Dave. Yeah, good morning,
everyone. Are you with us,
everyone.
Pradeep?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, sure, yeah. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So a quick update about where we are currently with regards to the patient matching project is last week we had a discussion about the cross domains. What would be the cross domains that would be involved in this project and the logical next steps? So we started framing a use case. Initially, we started the use case with the basic building blocks, which is like healthcare, schooling system, as well as housing department. So it's like we started talking about it, and then during the course of last week's conversation, it was also highlighted that social services and Department of Corrections might be good addition to this proof of concept that we are thinking about with different cross domains. So right now, I mean, there are 5 domains that we are considering for this use case. The use case is about a kid living in low-income housing who has asthma exacerbations and absenteeism as well as ER visits, and he's living with a mom and with some opioid issues and regarding some encounters with the Department of Justice or Corrections. So that is the use case that we have identified last week based on the conversation. And then where we are currently is we are trying to identify the important questions like the data models at different sites, because everyone will be having different systems, as well as we are talking about data that is being interacted outside of the healthcare, as well as how does this look when it comes to the data use agreements, or what are the modalities and the different data models for confirmation, like is it like a FHIR-based model, or are there any APIs that are currently being explored with regards to patient matching? So that's where we are currently, and we would like to use this as a working session to talk more about how do we resolve or identify the same individual, in fact, as the same individual being present in different systems, and also how do we confirm the certainty of the match if the fields are different, and also trying to identify what are the different fields within different domains that we would need to interact to identify that, in fact, it's the same individual. And what is the way to accommodate the patient matching algorithms? I mean, patient matching algorithms related to clear text matching as well as encrypted matching like PPRL, some hashed approach. So that's where we are. Currently we are in the state of exploratory stage where we are trying to understand more and ask more questions. So Rita, did I miss anything?
No, I think you summarized it really well. The only thing that I remember from last week that I thought was interesting that might be relevant to today's discussion is whenever we're trying to understand how different domains are doing their identity, like it didn't seem like there was like a common way or even like a way to like actually identify a person. So that's probably just something good to keep in mind in terms of like just thinking of, I guess, like agnostic mechanisms, or thinking that there is just one way, one approach. So I don't really have anything else to add.
Sure. Thank you, Rita. Thank you. So Dave, that's the update from us.
Okay, so Who on the line? I know Eric. Eric Kruger. You mentioned last time that you all were trying to avoid a unique identifier for an individual. Did I say that right?
Yes, we're trying not to proliferate that identifier out into the ecosystem. The MPI might have an identifier internally to link things together, but as soon as you share that, then you have lots of synchronization problems when you do data maintenance and corrections.
Oh, interesting, interesting.
What would be the alternative as a follow-up question? Like, what would be the other way of doing it?
And Eric, this is Pradeep.
Instead of saving that identifier, if you have an MPI that's a request response, you have a payload of data, Eric Kruger, date of birth, and you request, who is this person? And do you have any matches for this person? And it comes back with a set of probable matches with their confidence interval and related data about that person. Now,
so in essence, multi-factor matching.
Yeah, yeah.
Which doesn't give, the other problem with a single ID is that you just create another opportunity for identity theft.
Correct.
So multi-factor, it's really hard to steal all of somebody's history.
So I'm just trying to wrap my head around this because I'm very excited about this concept. The response is a series of personal identifiers that were matches. And then so what if in the response set there were two John Smiths, right? Then how do you reference the first one and not the second one? Normally you just respond with, you reference that as the ID for each of the two John Smiths. But how would you do it if the identifiers were very similar? What would you just refer it with all the identifiers for that match back again when you're re-requesting?
Well, if there was three John Smiths, there has to be something unique about them. So the system would have an identifier that says this John Smith is 1, this John Smith is 2, and this John Smith is 3. But along with that, that John Smith has a Department of Corrections number, a student ID number, something else that you're interoperating with that other organization.
An address, an emergency contact, all kinds of other information that is highly personal to help distinguish between multiple John Smiths.
Correct.
Yeah. Yeah, this time there's two, I just want to throw in here, there's three sets of patterns that we see in this space. One has to do with, we just talked about the probabilistic matching, which is based on, potentially anywhere from 5 to 7 different pieces of information about the people. But if you don't have all those pieces, then the probabilistic matching kind of has to be cross-checked with something that's hopefully a little more deterministic. One thing that put forward at the Health IT Standards panel some years ago was the notion of almost like what Equifax does in terms of identity proofing, where identifiers are ultimately aggregated based on any of the IDs that a person has in their wallet. So instead of relying on an insurance member ID or a patient ID from a hospital or something, you can also basically become an aggregator where when you get those people matched together, you start collecting the various IDs that they may have, such as their driver's license number, etc. So if you don't always have the 5 normal identifiers of a person, name, date of birth, gender, etc., that if they have anything on them at all, any sort of identity, that you can crosswalk and get a more deterministic match to the person. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. This is Pradeep, and I do have a follow-up question. So, are you referring to more like referential matching, where non-healthcare related data is being used to resolve the individual? Is it more moving towards an enhanced probabilistic matching, where both healthcare and non-healthcare derived data are being used for resolving the identity? Am I understanding it correctly?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
I think you want to stick with more demographic data than specific health data for that, only because you wander into privacy issues.
Sure, absolutely. And let me correct myself. It's like when I was saying healthcare, I was more talking about data from healthcare institutions, not specific to medical conditions. But thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Hi, and no, I'm Art. I have a couple of comments, sort of from the public health experience. First, I'm puzzled by the notion of not returning sort of the MPI ID once you successfully match someone. What we found in public health is that it's quite useful, so that the next time you're trying to match the same person from the same source, you don't sort of go through this all over again. It's not clear to me how revealing an internal MPI subjects someone realistically to identity theft any more than the underlying data that matched it in the first place. But
you're talking about a system-specific identifier as opposed to a national patient ID.
Right, right. I mean, the person who made that comment was talking about the MPI ID that came from that MPI. I thought he said that's not returned.
It's the national. It's the national. No, it's the national patient ID concept that I have a problem with. The last time that was brought up at a symposium, I said, well, why not just use social security numbers? And the first thing that came out of somebody's mouth was, well, they've already been stolen. They're no longer unique. To which I said, well, how long do you think a national patient ID is going to last?
That's a whole other rabbit hole, and we can have a separate discussion at another time. I just thought that I heard someone say, in the context of a system-specific MPI, not a national one, but a system-specific one.
I have no problem with that. No.
Okay.
Why not? Local shortcut.
Right.
Yeah.
The other comment that I would say.
I'd like to clarify also that I think for computer systems that interoperate, we do need that MPI system number. I'm just not advocating that people carry that around and it's used to present in the business world.
No, it's 32 characters.
Right. I'm not saying that either. Okay. But it can be very useful to return in an automated query, so that the next time you want to make the same query from a participating local system, you already have the MPI ID, and that just needs to be corroborated with some demographics to make sure you didn't just, you aren't just randomly sending in IDs. The other point that I would make.
The only point I get upset about is if it turns into a global ID because you match the system name or the system ID plus the local patient ID, and then suddenly everybody's sharing that, and then suddenly it becomes a target for, I can appropriate that particular ID and get free healthcare.
No,
right.
You'd want
the other point that I would make on the issue of a partial match and returning candidate records for review is that one of the problems, at least in public health, is that in many jurisdictions, you can't send back to someone who queried you anything they didn't know already, right? So I can't reveal information about the 3 possible John Smiths, because I may be revealing PHI that you didn't know, you the person making the query. So in some jurisdictions, it's very problematic when you can't make an exact match to one patient. The jurisdiction sort of has to throw up its hands and say, well, then query again with more information. I can't show you differentiating information about 3 John Smiths because I'm revealing something that might help you figure out which one it is, but I'm not allowed to reveal that to you.
Especially with human services, PHI can include demographic information like someone's address, and that is problematic.
I can't send back 3 John Smiths and 3 even pretty close but slightly different addresses and tell you to pick, because I'm revealing PHI about 3 John Smiths that I'm not supposed to reveal to you.
So I think we've kind of teased out a new requirement, which is no reuse of other systems' IDs if possible. That way there's no sort of tacit aggregation of them or just a system-specific globally unique ID is getting turned into some sort of de facto national identifier, even though there was no policy. So in other words, we should have a preference towards each system having its own IDs, and maybe certain systems track the source ID and then their newly assigned ID just for like, matching purposes with syncing with other systems. But essentially each system is going to be generating its own GUIDs, and there's no sort of social security number like identifier that's being proliferated across the health and human services systems, if that makes sense.
I'm not sure I would agree with that. I mean, that's a conversation we have to have about a sort of global ID. We've had a couple of comments that have raised some concerns about that, but there's a whole boatload of people that think that's the only way to go. So I'm not willing to throw that out just yet myself.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, well, this time I think there are enough examples in the States now of both in the private sector and the healthcare community around master patient indexes, and in public services in the realm of what they call common client indexes. I think there are enough examples of these things around that we can leverage those patterns and not have to go there in terms of getting into that fight. You know what I mean?
So is this unique identifier that we've been just talking about, we'll call it an MPI for the moment, is that the key to cross-domain name matching, or what is the key to cross-domain name matching, where we're trying to, if you will, join somebody in education with their healthcare information, and we want in both domains to make sure we're talking about the same individual? Is the MPI the magic that's going to allow us to cross domains?
Actually, Dave, I think this is where the Mayan folks would be most helpful. The solution that they came up with the tokens that they use. Mm-hmm. That was a rather innovative approach that not too many people have deployed, but it's not again, the unifying ID is an internal concept, but they do use a set of tokens to, shall we say, group related sets of information that belong to the same person. I think having, if they're going to join this call, if they can kind of give us a précis of what they've done, I think people will find it quite good.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, and Tom, I do have a follow-up here. So thank you for that information. So is it more like creating a pseudo identifier for the real identifiers just for the purpose of the just to link or merge the records?
Yeah, so there are multiple pseudo identifiers that ultimately get linked together internally in the record. Think of it as one thread of ID versus multiple, maybe 2 or 3 different threads of ID that belong to different domains, but internally they are linked together. And you can walk from one to the other using the internal ID, but that internal ID is basically just a system ID. It's not published.
Sure.
And I don't think you would want it to be published because then, the next, I think somebody else earlier mentioned the issues of, data getting out of sync, and there is a rather labor-intensive process in terms of maintaining these links. Sometimes things get linked together that don't belong together, and they have to be separated. And sometimes people fall through the cracks because matching isn't good enough, and you find duplicates that ultimately need to be linked. But you can't rely on a system to do that automatically. It requires human intervention to resolve the difference.
Sure. That's a great point. So it's more like creating bundles of the pseudo identifiers, right? Like using different original identifiers. For example, it can be one bundle can be generated from first name and date of birth, and the other can be first name, last name, and date of birth. So this is trying to match individuals on different possibilities.
Dave?
Yes.
I'm just thinking, this is brainstorming here, but for the purpose of getting to a proof of concept, like you're trying to get to, I'm wondering if we can't sort of componentize this problem a little bit and go to somebody who's already built a solution that is very, very contemporary, like Jeff Jonas and his AI-based entity resolution stuff. We used his software in the project in Silicon Valley where we were sharing data across schools and social services and justice very effectively. He's really, I think, kind of solved this problem for us, and he was willing to contribute something as a proof of concept without any money in that instance. And, I think Jeff is one of the leaders in this field in the country, and has certainly, gone through this from his work at IBM and now his own company. I'm just suggesting that maybe you want to explore talking to him about just getting something that we could plug into your enterprise architecture.
Yeah. I think that would be great, Paul, and I will reach out to you to get the connection with Jeff Jonas.
Sure.
To see, because I think having some potentially workable cases would help us in the discussion as we move forward.
Yeah, and he's attacked this.
This is Brian. I agree, and as always, the more hands, the better.
Right.
A rising tide lifts all boats, all those, good aphorisms.
You can look at his stuff at senzing.com, SENZING.com.
Thanks. But I'll be reaching out to you to make the connection there. I think that makes a lot of sense. So, Paul, based on what you know of it, is it then practical for us to define some APIs that would abstract us away from the details a little bit, and that all or most of the domains could comply to that API and therefore get the cross-domain name matching?
I think it's possible. I'm not 100% sure that it is, but I think it is because, what we've done and I'll talk more about this next week, but in the public safety world, when you do this, when you actually get down to the nitty gritty of making a query and getting a response, what people are fond of doing is what I like to call the yes, no, maybe matching notion, that you define a set of parameters, data components, like name, address, age, race, height, whatever you want to define, and use that to do your retrieval of a set, which you then rank probabilistically as a function of the discriminatory power of those data elements in the database that you're searching. And it's really, most of that work has been done when what you might think of as self-contained master name indexes, not just somebody else's list. And then, so if you get a match on some defined level of probability in 95% or 98% of X data elements, then it's an automatic match. If you don't get any of those, it's an automatic non-match. And then there's a set of those that are maybes that have to be, manually evaluated to see if it's a match or not. That's the way it's always been done in public safety for years and years and years. But the criteria are pretty much common across these systems. It is things like name and first name, middle name, last name. In the law enforcement world, the more reliable name is middle name, because crooks tend to change their first and last names, but interestingly, they hardly ever change their middle name.
Didn't know that.
Things like Social Security are not useful because crooks are fond of getting multiple Social Security numbers and, or finding some dead person and using that Social Security number. So that's very unreliable. You have to look at what is the discriminatory power of the data element in the specific domain in which you're working, and how that can be used to evaluate the probability you assign to a match given to you by that particular data element.
So Pradeep, question for you. Have you given much thought to, I'll call it the edge cases, if you will, like infants and so forth? Are there a substantial number of those edge cases that we need to be concerned with?
So I think, yeah, because one of the things, and someone can correct me, I think we should be concerned about the special patient populations, is because for some instances, since they do not have any financial transactions, their parent or guardian information may have to be used in order to make some linkages, because in some instances, they may be having some temporary names, and parent or guardian's information needs to be used to resolve the identity of that individual, or in some instances, if there are twins, then we need to even resolve the identity of those two kids as well. So yeah, I have been thinking about it, Dave. That's a great question. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So this may be a bit of a stretch, but hopefully one of the things that this Let's Get Technical group can do is to consider things that at this point might be higher risk, but it seems to be where the world is going to. So I'll throw one out there, and that is face recognition. I realize it's probably going to have a whole bunch of edge cases which are going to be problematic, but have many people given thought to the facial detection, face detection software as a potential unique identifier?
Yeah, except you have a lot of cities and states now attempting to block the use of the facial recognition, and that for any purpose.
I did not know that.
Yeah, 4 cities have now passed resolutions forbidding the use of it in any governmental operation.
Yeah, that said, I'd say that there are use cases in place today. Then it really depends on who's doing it and for what purpose. I think the ones that give people access is using surveillance camera data to locate potential, people who are in the country illegally, things like that. But Department of Motor Vehicles, for example, use facial recognition now to catch people who have driver's licenses in multiple states. That's a use case that's in production today. So it is being used in certain use cases. Others are more controversial.
But at the same time, there have been research projects that have shown that, for instance, a recent one showed that facial recognition matches of, the 10 most wanted actually matched a number of senators, which of course was somewhat embarrassing to the senators.
Yeah, maybe they're the 10 most wanted.
I think for the purposes of this discussion, is there a way we can just abstract these concepts? And I was thinking the same thing regarding the matching algorithms and the AI and all that under the black box of that technology. But a lot of that will always be proprietarily implemented and such. But I'm thinking, is there a larger concept we can use for all these biometrics / other kinds of identifying mechanisms such that our API can just, as these technologies come and go, increase or decrease in public's favor, we could just plug in a new one for the purposes of our interface.
That makes all the sense in the world to me.
This is Eric Kruger at DOH in Washington. I'd like one comment about the proprietary matching algorithms. Being proprietary is really problematic because when you're working with data scientists and they publish their work, and let's say it's a PhD, they can't rely on something being proprietary because they have to test the confidence interval, the false positives and the false negatives. And so we really need to have algorithms be public.
Well, this doesn't live in multiple public algorithms.
Right.
It's just a question of which algorithm is being used at the moment, and then is it public or private?
Well, I think we should have the ability to have multiple algorithms because things change over time.
Agreed.
Yeah, if I'm matching patients for HIV, I want 99.9%. If I'm finding probable matches to locate somebody for a parole officer, it could be 80%.
Well, that's an important distinction that you have to make in all this, is if you're looking for, it just gets back to the use case. What are you trying to do? And they're really two separate classes. One is matching an individual for the purpose of taking some action with respect to that individual versus collecting data for research purposes, where you're looking at a set of people across a whole, some particular set of characteristics to do a study or do matching across in large numbers. And the matching requirements are different.
Correct.
So one of the things I think we want to do is collect additional experts. The one that Paul recommended was Jeff Jonas, that we could get on one of these calls. We also talked about the MyHIN people getting on there. I personally like the concept, and I think it was Eric who mentioned it, of kind of a pluggable set of APIs where you could replace specific technologies where you've abstracted from the details of a technology. And that's consistent with some of the things we said last week, which was we want minimal integration efforts in these systems to tie them together. So if there was a set of APIs and some unique technology was allowed to be plugged in underneath of that, the applications using it wouldn't necessarily have to change. So are there other efforts, other people that folks on the call are aware of that we should have participate with us and give us their perspective on it? Jeff, go ahead.
Hi, I actually have a comment on the last thing that you said, Noah Mark speaking, about APIs. We've been talking a lot about APIs, but the truth is, in my experience in patient matching, there aren't a lot of open APIs. I mean, PICS-PDQ from IHE is the only open API that I'm aware of. So unless folks know others or we collect other information about others, we have to be careful about just sort of waving our hands and saying, well, the APIs will all make this, pluggable and playable. When in the patient matching world, in the person matching world, I haven't actually seen that really happen. Everything is proprietary, just about.
Well, New York State did one for patient matching that's open, albeit, it was originally based on Nome, but, we're talking about number of angels dancing on the head of a pin, given that it's just a set of XML schemas.
Is FHIR, that's proprietary, isn't it? It's owned by Health Level 7, or how does that one work?
No, but it
it
doesn't really have a matching API.
It's a patient get API, and the matching algorithm is under the hood in the code, but the interface between the systems is simply get me a patient, here are the IDs. And so maybe what we're looking for is already there, but it's very simple.
Yeah, and actually somebody mentioned earlier the New York City Nome IEPDs. The project that you're talking about is called Access New York City. And they do have a fair amount of information available about their what they call their common client index that they've used to try to match people across all the various domains of services in New York City. And it's a good, solid body of work. The gentleman who ran that project his name is Kamal Barwani. He's now CEO of a company here in New York. If we want to delve into that as an example of something that's working in the real world, say, can connect you guys in if you like.
Yeah, I would be curious about that. I actually do a lot of work in New York City with the health department, and I think one of our systems is probably one of the source systems to that. So we're shielded from some of that.
Yeah, and actually there's a body of work that the City Department of Health may still have, a project that goes back several years. It was a biosurveillance use case that they worked on as part of the nationwide health information network trial implementation. It wasn't identity matching like this per se, but it's a good example of what they call pseudonymification. Easy for you to say. Where basically they needed to deal with data that was largely de-identified, but they needed to be able to get back to the individual's identity in certain circumstances, in certain biosurveillance situations, like if it was thinking of the the recent measles outbreak in New York, things like that. There's a body of work there that City DOH may still have that would be useful.
Also, on the human services side, I pasted in the chat the open source APIs we use for HS Link and their Creative Commons. So, I mean, really, it's not very. There's not a lot in the search, and it's modeled after the FHIR way of doing it, except independently built. So it's not proprietary. But my point is, I think another example also could be the pluggable authentication module used in the open source world. But my point is, I don't think there's a lot to the interface of the patient match. The code under the hood is what we might be talking about standardizing or working on in some way, such that these are a high percentage, accuracy and such. But I think that goes beyond the interface.
It's really the algorithm. You're right. It's not the interface. It's the algorithm that's used. I think that's, there's a very interesting model here, Dave, that I just recently got involved with. In this FirstNet program, the $7.5 billion that Congress authorized for public safety for the wireless broadband network, AT&T has a contract for that. And what they've done is they've actually created a store available to public safety agencies, that one store for apps for mobile phones that are involved in this, and they've got over 50 different apps that you can download. But they also have a store for APIs, and I think it would be really interesting to think about that, the idea of building a store for identity matching algorithms, and reach out to the people that have developed them, that are willing to disclose their algorithms and let people evaluate them.
That sounds good, Paul. So question, you're talking about a group like Let's Get Technical starting a store and then finding the capabilities that can be added to the store. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I know there are agencies out there. For example, San Diego's done a lot of work in identity matching for their health and human services system, which is very well integrated across both the health and human services worlds. And I think IBM actually built their software, but I don't believe that they built was proprietary. I think San Diego, if you asked them, would give you the algorithm and share it.
Gotcha.
Basis for what they're using for matching across their domain. I've
requested their code. I haven't gotten it, just for the record.
What?
I've requested the code from the San Diego CIE, the matching and such, since it's a great starting point for any new project, and I've not received it. I haven't found a way to get that. And from what I understand of the San Diego project, it's a cobbling together of proprietary products such as Salesforce.com and some other kinds of AI that's been or business logic that's from proprietary vendors. So I'm not so certain that maybe the script that they run is open source and they've posted that, but I haven't been able to find a thing. So if somebody has it, I'd love to look at it.
We have some connections there. We might be able to help get you that.
Yeah, and Dave, another resource you might want to consider along the lines of the quote-unquote API store. You're familiar with the Connect project at ONC?
Yes.
There was an effort with that group, I think it was in conjunction with the Federal Health Information Model work. It had to do with a concept called service discovery, where basically instead of having to know what a service is called, how you interact with it, that you could basically search for it and consume the instruction, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how far they've gone with that in recent years, but I know they started work on that a few years ago. It might be worth reaching out to them and see what state it's in. it might be useful.
Super. So, Tom, it could have been you that Nome was asking to get in touch with on the New York City in the chat.
Sorry?
I was just looking for a contact for whoever was talking about that New York City stuff. If you're online, as opposed to just on the phone, and can sort of type your contact in information into the chat.
Yeah, David, you can do that for me. I'm just on the phone, so.
Okay. So I'm sorry. You're Tom. What's your last name, Tom?
Sylvia.
Okay,
this is Daniel.
If you could forward some contact and information from him to me, that would be useful. If you could do that, Daniel.
Yeah, Tom, you're on the hub, right? Have you signed as a member? Because he should be on there as well. So you should be able to directly.
Yeah, I'm on the hub. I have an ID on the hub, but I'm not logged into it now.
Okay, no, but I'm just saying, no. Anybody on the call can find anybody else on the member, but we can forward it to you as well. No. I also wanted to mention that one of the folks that works with us as stewards, Ivy Poole, worked on HHS Connect for many years, and then moved up to the state and was, worked pretty directly on those things. So she's another good contact, maybe a couple years old, but she's also, was deeply involved with Linda and the mayor and that whole group there around putting, HHS Connect together and Access NYC. So there's another source of contact information there. So I'll reach out to her as well. And the other mention I just put on the chat was, I think Dan Chavez has some pretty good or pretty strong opinions about patient matching and what they've been trying to do and the groups they're with. So when we can double back with him, I think he'll be able to be a good source for identifying whether or not they're proprietary or not. So. And I think a lot of them are IBM proprietary solutions or other vendors, as you mentioned, as I mentioned, or as somebody mentioned earlier.
So I'll have to reach back out, but I think the individual who was by and large responsible for what Dan put up down there had reached out to me. So I'll reach out to him again and see if we can get him on one of these calls. So what I'm envisioning is a series of experts, whether that be Jeff Jonas or Glenn, the guy I was just mentioning, or Myhin, others, to see if we can't schedule them to get on one of these working calls that's focused on the person matching algorithms. Does that make sense to people to kind of have industry experts gather on this?
I'd say yes, open source especially. I have another one for the list, Sean Granis from the Open Health Information Exchange. I think he's the architecture lead for that whole project. And he worked, I believe, with HHS on the, I'm not positive of this, but with the open EMPI additional features that HHS and Connect open source added into open EMPI before it went closed. I don't know what they call it now, but I think it's still open EMPI. But I think he would be great to have in there as well. And I think there's some interest in reviving where that open source project left off under another trademark or an open brand. So that I think Sean Granis would be another that would be great.
And what was it?
Sean is at Regan Street, and he's sort of a general wizard about everything. We also work with an open source probabilistic matching product called Choicemaker.
Okay.
If interested in, and we use that actually in New York City with the immunization registry, and have done so for 20 years.
Thank you. I'll look into Choicemaker.
Gentlemen, that was just
done by the California Department of Health and identity matching and a variety of state registries, as well as other functionality that we'll not be able to get our hands on.
for the gentleman that just referenced the New York effort with immunization, have you by any chance worked or heard of Angel Aponte?
Yeah, Angel and I are buddies. I work with Angel all the time, every day. I mean, we've been supporting the immunization registry. Angel's sort of at the juncture of a set of projects. So yeah, he's someone who I was going to reach out to.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking as well.
Well, I wonder, Daniel, if this discussion isn't an ideal candidate for discussion on the hub, so we can gather these experts and opinions and so forth. Does that sound like a good fit to you?
Yeah, I think that's actually the perfect point of it. I think that Nava's taking notes on this, and she'll send those around. Folks should be able to access those notes pretty soon in the next day or two, as well as the ones from last week. We're trying to get a little quicker on the note publishing, but that's one thing. But I think it would be great if there was a discussion thread started and making sure we're capturing these things as well as the action items, follow-ups, and starting to aggregate this either just on the thread or on a Google Doc that we can set up on the hub. But I think that's the purpose, is that if there's been a lot of different resources and assets identified here from different people, which is exactly, the whole purpose of this is to put together, combined knowledge. And I think to do that on the hub, right on the group, on the project will be great. And I think we just probably need to change the project from a person matching to maybe person matching and POC. But that would be a good exercise, especially as people come in and out of this. So we have a pretty available resource as we go forward without it just being stuck in someone's head or in somebody's file. So we'll take that as a follow-up, and Dave and Rita and Pradeep, we can look at trying to, curate that information in a way that will be useful to folks. Some of the key ideas and some of the action items that work.
Yeah, absolutely. I have been taking some notes as well, Daniel. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Well, we'll circulate those around for folks to be able to look at. Yeah, I had you, while I got the microphone here, I just had one thought while we were talking a while ago, a couple of conversations earlier. We were talking about, what's the right, the correct confidence interval for matching. And there was some discussion around, depending on who the audience is, who the user is. It occurred to me that we might want to think about, from a protocol or a perspective of like the use case, and the use case that Pradeep explained or described has a lot of different users in it. So as opposed to the concept of the lowest common denominator, I wonder if we want to have a concept of, as you look at the use case, what's the highest common denominator, and everything needs to match to that. So if there's a situation where the PII, because of maybe behavioral health or alcohol and drug abuse, is going to require, just a very high degree confidence of matching, maybe everything needs to match to that level. Or there's some kind of policy or protocol that says what is the highest common denominator, so we know what we're going after, and different use cases can be sort of targeted at that level. I just would put that out there to sort of think about, is there a way we can organize that?
Well, and I would add the notion of role-based to that, because, like, for example, in the use case that we were circulating earlier this week, if you're a caseworker, or if you're a clinician on somebody's care team, or if you have say a data use agreement in place, or a business associate agreement, or something that allows you to work with this data, that means a different set of results and a different set of capabilities than if you don't. And so the decision of, match or no match, share or don't share, is going to be different depending on who you are in that food chain and what kind of agreements you have in place.
Yeah, you also have to take into account in addition to the role-based, which I agree with, the potential for doing damage by having made a match. If you're trying to identify a person because you're going to, you know, if the physician has said, I'm going to have to amputate your leg, you want to be damn sure you're talking to the right person. You know, it's like in law enforcement, people worry about making sure that the person arrested is the right person, so that if you're going to take somebody into jail, you better be sure you're looking at the same person that you were trying to arrest. So the severity and the importance of the identity match is related to the extent to which you're doing damage by having made the match.
Gotcha.
Dave, is everyone still on? I just saw a message on the screen there.
Yep.
Okay. Dave, a couple of thoughts come to mind. One is everybody should have seen in the last notification that we're starting to publish a calendar of activities over the next 3 weeks right now. And Paul mentioned next week he's going to be talking about public safety and that specific domain. And then we've got two other activity topics coming up the following 2 weeks. And then we are in the midst of preparing for the next couple of months. So we have a calendar there. So one of the questions is on the POC, what's the right cadence, so to speak, of check-in? So do we reserve, we have to balance out the amount of time, for doing these kind of in-depth conversations with kind of intermittent updates and then reporting in and reporting out. So I don't know if we have an answer to that yet, and I don't know what the right frequency is to that. I don't know if folks have a perspective on that. I mean, I think it would be good to get a regular update on things and progress, but we also want to balance that out with, sort of new content and new ideas and new people presenting.
Yeah, I agree. So do people have a perspective on that, what the cadence should be for this discussion as we move forward? Because there's a lot of other things we need to talk about as well.
Well, this is Adam. I have two thoughts. They're not answers, but to put in the mix. One is I think we should be flexible. That is, even if we have a calendar of what's happening in the next 3 weeks, if something else makes sense, from a ground level because of the conversation or because of where the project is, whatever. I mean, I believe everyone would be fine if we said, well, why don't we postpone, X in order to have a conversation in 2 weeks about, the proof of concept or whatever the topic may be. Because, for example, early on, we've had conversations where we wanted to continue that conversation for the next week, right? And I think we should be flexible enough to do that, not all the time, but as the need arises or as the desire arises. So I think that should be a factor. And the second thing, I guess, is obvious, which is that some of these conversations that are technical in nature don't necessarily have to be on a Friday at noon. They can be scheduled for another time, so they don't have to necessarily get into the flow of whatever else is scheduled.
That makes sense, Adam. So what I'm going to suggest is we use the notes that Nova is creating for us, make sure that we've captured all of the thoughts and ideas so far, and see if we can't get the experts in there to join us on the hub. I don't want to make it difficult for people to communicate at all, But something like the hub makes a lot of sense if you're going to have a broader community starting to engage in the conversation. So I don't know whether people like Jeff Jonas would be willing to do that, or whether we need a surrogate to him to be able to post his remarks on the hub as well. But I think one of the things we should do is look at the notes, because there was a lot of ideas that came up on this conversation. See how we can best engage people who are experts on this, because there's quite a few of them, and the focal point of that could be gathering the information and putting it on the hub for more discussion. I think it'd be great.
Dave, this is Daniel. I had one other thought, just in terms of, you know, active members in terms of your experience or other people's experience running this kind of POC. It might be helpful to know, you know, if everybody's kind of all in, or, you know, if everybody wants to be sort of contributing and participating, and sort of, you know, so just knowing that as we're asking people for time and energy. And do we kind of have a little sign-up sheet that says, yeah, I'm all in, or I'm a support and consultant on this? I don't know if, when you've done this in the past, I don't know how you delineated roles, so to speak, and whether or not that would be helpful and how helpful that would be. So anyone who's done these kind of POCs in the past, it would be great to hear that. Some thoughts before we sign off soon.
So Tom, you've certainly been engaged in that. What are your thoughts on that? Having kind of a gathering together, what the role might be.
Yeah, Dave. So I guess what in our experience, I think you know, usually at the beginning there are a lot of contributors and a lot of ideas put around, and then it ultimately boils down to a core team who actually has to do the work, right? And so you know, it's really just sort of been by natural attrition in the past, not really asking people what their interest was. But with a group this size, actually, Daniel, that might make some sense, is to try to see if we can line up who the core team is going to be of the doers of the POC. I think there are a number of pieces that we need to collect that have already been built from certain companies and individuals. There are other things that need to be built. We need to kind of hand out those homework assignments. So that I guess the kind of the dichotomy is people who are interested in giving input, validating output, etc. That's one set of folks. And then another set of folks that are actually going to be in the meat of building the components of the POC and sewing it together.
Makes sense for Tom, either you or Dave or somebody, to come up with a work breakdown structure of what are the individual pieces that do need to be developed so that people can sign up to undertake?
Yeah. Well, actually, I think one of the first things that we should do, kind of as the broader group, is to agree on the set of things that we're going to include in the POC. Because as I learned pretty quickly in pulling together the narrative for it, there's potentially a little there or a lot there, depending on what we're able to do. And there's data that has been already curated as a starting point. Are we going to go there? Are we going to change the topics? Are we going to include certain things, not include certain things? Nailing that down, I think, is probably a good first step to determining who then needs to be part of that core team.
I agree, Tom. So with your permission, Tom, I'm going to reach out to you and see if I can coordinate with you and gather your thoughts as we move forward on it.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, well, I think that's, Daniel, would you like to add anything at the end here?
Yeah, just a quick thought, just what I kind of reiterated before, which is next week we have Paul is going to be providing some insights and discussion around public safety, and then we'll reserve some time to do a check-in on the POC and person matching, and then ideally before then we'll start to sort of post some more materials on the hub and on the project itself, so people can get used to looking there for that, and then hopefully we can kind of, if Tom is able to do a rough outline of the sort of the sign-up sheet, sort of, so we can get a sense of commitment, we should be great. And that's all I got to say.
Okay, that's it for me. I just wanted to thank everybody for participating. I thought there was a lot of really valuable information in getting started, but I wanted to single out Pradeep and Rita as well for all their good work in this group getting it started. It seems like we've got traction and a lot to learn as we go forward. So thank you all very much for all your help.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Dave. Thanks, everyone.
Have a good weekend.
Okay.